More research is highlighting the role that racism plays in the mental health of black people in the United States. The literature reviews published in The Lancet Psychiatry analyze more than 50 years of research on the effects of racism. Researchers found black Americans have greater exposure to risk factors for mental illness. That includes living in low-income neighborhoods, lower quality education, greater exposure to violence, and high rates of homelessness. Joining me now is Dr. Ayana Jordan. She is the Barbara Wilson Associate Professor of Psychiatry in the Department of Psychiatry at New York University. She's also an Associate Professor in the Department of Population Health. She's also the lead author of this series of papers. Thank you for joining me, Doc. It's always good to see you. Thank you so much also for engaging such an important topic. When I hear this, one of the things I wondered was, are there specific types of mental illness that disproportionately impact black people?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me, Marc. Happy New Year. So when we're thinking about specific types of mental illness, there are actually not more mental illnesses that affect Black people. In fact, Black people have the same rates of mental illness, and sometimes if we're talking about different illnesses, even less than other people. But the issue is that we're overdiagnosed with certain types of illnesses. So things like schizophrenia and other type of psychotic illnesses, when people are not in touch with reality, we are more likely to be diagnosed with those types of illnesses and underdiagnosed for mood disorders like major depressive disorder or an anxiety. So there is a bias in the system itself.
Ah, that's interesting. I think that's an important distinction to make because otherwise people might walk around thinking that black people are just prone to having more mental health problems as opposed to the ecological factors, and of course also the ways you just said, the way we go about framing and analyzing the problems. In your paper, you and your co-authors say that mental health is looked at through the frame of white supremacy. There are people out there that are going to be like, what does white supremacy have to do with mental health? Mental health is an objective measure. Either you got this problem or you don't. What does white supremacy have to do with any of this?
Yeah, I love that's such a good question, because when we're talking about white supremacy, we're just talking about this false belief, right? That white people are superior and therefore should dominate societal norms and centering their own cultural attitudes. So when we're thinking about how does that relate to mental illness, if we use a white supremacist method, meaning that we're using tools that center white people's experiences, it's always going to minimize the experiences and understanding of Black illness. So what do I mean? For example, the gold standard that we use to diagnose people with mental illness is called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders. In no way does that manual actually take into account things like oppression, dehumanization, trauma, violence. So how can we expect to have an accurate diagnosis if we are not even taking into the everyday understanding and experiences of people racialized as Black in this country? We're never going to get the right diagnosis because they are not understanding our own behaviors. So that's what I mean by that.
That's important too, because when we say white supremacist methods and framings, I don't want people to think that it's a bunch of doctors who secretly have hoods and KKK uniforms in the background. These might be people who don't have any animus toward black people in their own mind. They might be good people, but if we're trained, in fact, we could be black doctors. If we're trained using these methods and traditions, we'll still be looking at black people through a deficit. I learned a great deal from your work in that way. A recent study, by the way, in the American Journal of Psychiatry found that black children living in poverty deal with more instances of stress and trauma that can lead to the development of mental health issues as they get older. My audience wants to know what we can do to protect those babies. What can parents do, if anything, to better protect our children's mental health?
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you are covering the story because this is huge. It shows that Black children who are raised in poverty, right, who are exposed to violence, actually are at increased risk of developing mental illness, but also that you're actually seeing changes in the brain. So that is huge. And so when we're thinking about what we can do a lot. One of the things that we can do is start to talk with our children about what are they feeling? How are they doing? One of the things I do with my nieces and nephew all the time, I say, what made your heart smile today? What are things that made you uncomfortable? Start to normalize talking about conversations related to mental health. We also have to be very serious about advocating for our children and many of the public school systems that they interface. Ask about after school programming. There is a correlation with children that get after school programming being able to have better mental health outcomes. Making sure that we're involved in the political process so that we actually have equitable funding, right, for school systems, and also removing over policing in Black neighborhoods. We know that just the presence of police can be traumatic for many of our children. And so there's this falsity that more police are actually better, where we're seeing that can actually lead to more stress. So these are the things that we have to be involved in: public health funding, going to the school, advocating for research for our children, and normalizing conversations about mental health. How are you feeling? What made your heart smile? What made you uncomfortable? We have to talk with our children about these things.
That is so important. It's so fascinating how many solutions begin with talking and listening, engaging fundamentally our children. It's such a powerful thing. I appreciate your work. I appreciate your insights. Dr. Ayana Jordan, everybody. She is the Barbara Wilson Associate Professor of Psychiatry, the Department of Psychiatry at the famed New York University.